Alan Garrity's hands trembled with rage as he watched security footage of his housekeeper being hunted like a fugitive through his own neighborhood. Maria Gonzalez cowering behind rose bushes while armed guards stalked her for the crime of cleaning a black man's house. In his other hand, his phone buzzed with a call that would change everything. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had been watching Willowbrook Estates for months. The trap was already set. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. Alan Garrity had always believed that money could buy respect, or at least rent it by the hour. As his silver Lamborghini Huracan purred to a stop before the ornate iron gates of Willowbrook Estates on that sweltering August morning in 2024, he was about to discover just how expensive that particular delusion could be. The burgundy Tom Ford suit he wore still carried the faint scent of Dubai's desert air, a reminder of the 3-day business trip that had netted Gartec Solutions another $15 million contract with Emirates Bank. His phone buzzed incessantly against the Italian leather seat. 17 missed calls from Maria, his housekeeper, and a text message that had his jaw clenched tighter than his grip on the steering wheel. They won't let me in. Say you don't live here anymore. What should I do? The morning sun cast everything in golden hues, making the manicured lawns and towering oak trees look like something from a Southern Gothic novel. Which, Alan mused darkly, was probably more accurate than he'd care to admit. After all, what was the antebellum South without a few lingering ghosts? He'd purchased this slice of manufactured paradise 18 months ago, trading his downtown Atlanta penthouse for something with more space and admittedly more status. Willowbrook Estates wasn't just exclusive, it was exclusionary, the kind of place where membership in the country club came with an invisible asterisk that read, "Some restrictions may apply." But Alan had earned his place here through the kind of old-fashioned American dream that was supposed to transcend skin color. Hard work, brilliant innovation, and enough zeros in his bank account to make most people's calculators weep. The security booth sat like a small fortress beside the gates, all tinted windows and self-importance. 4 guards clustered around it now, their light blue uniforms crisp despite the humidity. Alan recognized 3 of them immediately. Johnson, Rodriguez, and Thompson, Webb's loyal disciples in the Church of Selective Enforcement. The 4th was Theola Machuca, standing slightly apart from the others with her characteristic blend of professionalism and barely concealed frustration. Machuca was the anomaly in Webb's carefully curated team, a fact that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone with functioning eyes. While the other guards treated Alan like a potential threat to suburban tranquility, she'd always been courteous and efficient. More importantly, she'd been fair, a quality that seemed to irritate her supervisor more than Alan's very existence. Alan rolled down his window as Johnson approached, the guard's swagger suggesting he'd confused his security uniform for a sheriff's badge. The man's pale face was already flushed from the heat, sweat stains darkening his shirt despite the early hour. "Morning, Johnson," Alan said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled patience he'd perfected in boardrooms. "Just getting back from Dubai. Long flight." Johnson's response was to lean against the car door with practiced insolence, his pale eyes scanning the Lamborghini's interior as if he might discover contraband between the premium leather seats. "Gonna need to see some identification, sir." Standard protocol. The "sir" dripped with enough sarcasm to fill a swimming pool. Alan had heard that tone before, in corporate meetings where competitors underestimated the black guy in the expensive suit, in restaurants where maitre d's assumed he was someone's driver, in countless interactions where his net worth became irrelevant the moment someone noticed his melanin. "You've been checking my ID for 18 months, Johnson," Alan replied, pulling out his driver's license anyway. "I live at 1247 Magnolia Drive. The Georgian colonial with the circular driveway and the fountain that looks like it belonged to a Renaissance duke with questionable taste." Johnson took the license with theatrical reluctance, holding it up to the light as if he suspected it might be a forgery worthy of the CIA. Behind him, Rodriguez and Thompson watched with the eager attention of hyenas waiting for scraps. Only Machuca maintained her professional distance, though Alan caught her eye roll when Johnson began examining the license with a magnifying glass that materialized from somewhere in his tactical vest. "This seems to be in order," Johnson announced after a performance that would have made Shakespeare proud. "But we've had some irregularities recently. Security concerns." I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle for a brief inspection." The words hung in the humid air like a challenge. Alan felt his blood pressure rise, a familiar sensation that had become as routine as his morning coffee since moving to Willowbrook. He'd been through this dance before, the deliberate delays, the manufactured complications, the small humiliations designed to remind him that his money couldn't buy him the one thing he'd thought it would, the assumption that he belonged. "Security concerns," Alan repeated, his voice flat. "What kind of security concerns, exactly?" "Well," Johnson said, puffing out his chest like a rooster claiming territory, "there have been reports of suspicious individuals attempting to gain unauthorized access to the community. We can't be too careful." Suspicious individuals. Alan let the phrase roll around in his mouth like a particularly bitter wine. "Let me guess, these individuals shared certain physical characteristics with me?" The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving instinctively toward the radio clipped to his belt. Thompson's smirk faltered slightly, as if he was beginning to realize that poking the millionaire might have consequences beyond their immediate entertainment. But Johnson, bless his oblivious heart, doubled down like a gambler with more ego than sense. "I don't know what you're implying, sir," he said, though his tone suggested he knew exactly what Alan was implying and found it hilarious. "We treat all residents with the same level of security screening." "Is that so?" Alan's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Tell me, Johnson, when was the last time you asked Patricia Whitman to step out of her Bentley for a brief inspection? Or how about Harrison Mills? I've seen him stumble through these gates at 3 a.m., drunk as a fraternity pledge, and somehow your security protocols never seem to apply." The color in Johnson's face shifted from flushed to mottled red, the kind of complexion that suggested either embarrassment or the early stages of a stroke. "That's different." "Different how?" Alan was out of the car now, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow over the shorter guard. The burgundy suit, tailored to perfection, made him look like what he was, a man who could buy and sell everyone within a 50-yard radius. "Because they're white." The question landed like a brick through a church window. Rodriguez actually took a step backward, and Thompson's hand moved to his radio with the urgency of someone calling for backup against a particularly dangerous butterfly. Even Machuca, who had maintained her professional composure throughout the encounter, straightened with the alertness of someone watching a wildfire approach a gas station. Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a fish struggling on dry land, his brain apparently unable to process the concept of a black man who refused to be intimidated by his polyester authority. It was, Alan reflected, probably the first time in the guard's career that someone had called his bluff with such precision. That's not, we don't." Johnson stammered, looking desperately toward his colleagues for support that wasn't forthcoming. "Let me make this simple for you," Alan continued, his voice dropping to the kind of quiet intensity that made corporate executives break into cold sweats. "I own a house in this community. I pay taxes on that house. I pay homeowners association fees. I contribute to the salary of every person standing here, including yours. And right now, you're preventing me from accessing my own property based on what you're calling security concerns that seem to have a remarkable correlation with my skin color." The morning air grew thick with tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Alan could hear the distant hum of lawn mowers and the splash of someone's pool, the sounds of suburban paradise continuing its performance while the ugly reality played out at its gates. Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it cracked like a teenager asking someone to prom. "Sir, maybe we should just—" "Call Webb," Johnson interrupted, his face now approaching the color of a ripe tomato. "Get Supervisor Webb down here. Now." Thompson's radio crackled to life, and Alan caught the tail end of a conversation that would have been amusing if it weren't so infuriating. Webb was apparently in the middle of his morning routine, which, based on the static-filled exchange, involved either consuming enough caffeine to power a small aircraft or explaining to his wife why the HOA budget couldn't cover her latest landscaping fantasies. "He'll be here in 5 minutes, Thompson announced with the satisfaction of someone who had just called in an airstrike. "Perfect," Alan said, leaning against his Lamborghini with the casual confidence of a man who had faced down hostile boardrooms and emerged with their lunch money. "This should be educational." Machuca finally spoke up, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that made the other guards look like children playing dress-up. "Mr. Garrity, I apologize for the delay. These gentlemen are overly enthusiastic about their duties." Johnson's head snapped toward her with the speed of a cobra striking at prey. "Officer Machuca, I don't recall asking for your opinion. And I don't recall needing your permission to do my job," she replied smoothly. "Which, unless I'm mistaken, involves treating all residents with courtesy and respect, not staging impromptu theater productions." The insult hit Johnson like a slap, his face cycling through several shades of red before settling on what Allen privately dubbed arterial bleeding crimson. Rodriguez actually snickered, though he tried to disguise it as a cough when Johnson's glare turned toward him. "When Supervisor Webb gets here," Johnson began. "When Supervisor Webb gets here," Machuca interrupted, "he's going to want to know why we detained a resident without cause, wasted taxpayer time, and created a potential liability issue for the Homeowners Association. I'm sure the board would be fascinated to hear about our creative interpretation of security protocols." Allen found himself genuinely impressed. Machuca had just delivered a master class in bureaucratic warfare, hitting Johnson with the kind of administrative threats that could make a security guard's life very complicated very quickly. The Homeowners Association took liability issues seriously, especially when they involved expensive lawsuits from residents who could afford lawyers that billed more per hour than most people made in a month. Johnson's mouth worked silently, his brain clearly struggling to process the possibility that his power trip might have actual consequences. The other guards shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their morning entertainment might cost them their jobs if things went sideways. The sound of an approaching golf cart announced Webb's arrival with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. The supervisor's vehicle puttered through the gates like a discount chariot, its driver radiating the kind of self-importance that could only come from years of unchecked authority over a captive suburban population. Webb stepped out of the cart with the theatrical gravity of a general surveying a battlefield, his gray hair perfectly styled despite the humidity and his uniform pressed to military precision. He was a man who had clearly spent considerable time and effort cultivating an image of unflappable authority, and Allen had to admit the performance was impressive. "Gentlemen," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of gravitas usually reserved for funeral directors and politicians, "what seems to be the problem here?" Johnson launched into his explanation with the enthusiasm of a student presenting a science project, complete with dramatic gestures and enough embellishment to qualify as fiction. According to his version of events, Allen had been aggressive and confrontational, had refused to comply with standard security procedures, and had made inflammatory accusations about racial profiling. Webb listened with the expression of a man being forced to endure a particularly boring sermon, occasionally nodding as if Johnson's theatrical presentation contained actual substance. When the guard finally finished his performance, Webb turned to Allen with the kind of practiced smile that politicians used when they were about to deliver bad news wrapped in false sympathy. "Mr. Garrity," Webb said, extending his hand in a gesture that managed to be both polite and condescending, "I apologize for any inconvenience. My team is simply being thorough in their duties. I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining security in our community." Allen stared at the offered hand for a moment, then looked Webb directly in the eyes. "What I understand," he said quietly, "is that your thorough security procedures seem to have a remarkably selective application." The smile never wavered from Webb's face, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir." "Then let me be more specific," Allen replied. "In the 18 months I've lived here, your guards have detained my landscaping crew, questioned my housekeeping service, and turned away my mail carrier. They've subjected my guests to interrogations that would make the TSA blush, and they've found reasons to delay my entry more times than I care to count. Meanwhile, I've watched white residents drive through these gates without so much as a wave, seen contractors work on their properties without harassment, and observed behavior from other residents that would result in my immediate ejection from the community." Webb's smile finally slipped, replaced by the kind of expression usually reserved for people who had just stepped in something unpleasant. "Mr. Garrity, I assure you that we treat all residents equally." "Do you?" Allen interrupted. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your definition of equal treatment has some interesting footnotes. Tell me, Webb, What's your theory on why every security incident in this community seems to involve people who look like me? The question hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, visible and choking. Johnson shifted nervously, suddenly finding the ground fascinating. Rodriguez and Thompson exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to realize their morning entertainment might have serious consequences. Only Machuca maintained her composure, watching the exchange with the alert attention of someone witnessing a master class in professional confrontation. Webb's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that Alan's words had hit their mark. Mr. Garrity, if you have specific complaints about our security procedures, I encourage you to address them through proper channels. The Homeowners Association has a formal process for handling resident concerns. The same Homeowners Association that told me they would take my concerns under advisement, while making it clear that maintaining the community's safety was their primary concern? Alan's laugh was bitter as black coffee. The same board that nodded sympathetically while Patricia Whitman explained how important it was to preserve our community standards? The reference to the board president's thinly veiled threats from the previous week's meeting clearly struck a nerve. Webb's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something uglier beneath. The face of a man who had been caught with his hand in the cookie jar and was running out of excuses. "Sir," Webb said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice and maintain a respectful tone. We have procedures here, and everyone is expected to follow them." Everyone. Alan stepped closer, and Webb actually took a half-step backward. Or just the residents who don't fit your particular vision of suburban paradise? The confrontation was escalating, and Alan could feel the familiar surge of anger that had been building for months finally reaching its breaking point. He had tried patience. He had tried diplomacy. He had tried every reasonable approach to addressing the systematic harassment that had made his life in Willowbrook a constant source of stress and humiliation. But as he stood there in his $3,000 suit, blocked from entering his own home by men whose salaries he helped pay, Alan Garrity finally understood something that 18 months of subtle discrimination had been trying to teach him. Some problems couldn't be solved with politeness, and some people would never respect anything but power. And power, as it happened, was something Alan had in abundance. The morning was about to become very educational indeed. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, each man waiting to see who would blink first. Webb's practiced authority was beginning to show hairline cracks, like expensive paint peeling under pressure, while Alan stood with the patient stillness of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. It was Machuca who broke the standoff, stepping forward with a kind of professional grace that made everyone else look like amateur actors in a community theater production. "Supervisor Webb," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to cut through the testosterone-thick air, "perhaps we should review the actual security protocols for resident re-entry. I believe they're quite clear on the matter." Webb's head snapped toward her with the speed of someone who had just heard a fire alarm. "Officer Machuca, I don't recall requesting your input on this matter. And I don't recall needing permission to prevent this situation from becoming a legal nightmare for the Homeowners Association," she replied smoothly. "Mr. Garrity is a verified resident with proper identification who has been detained without cause for," she glanced at her watch with theatrical precision, 17 minutes and counting. Alan found himself genuinely impressed by Machuca's performance. She was wielding bureaucratic procedure like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away Webb's authority with surgical precision. The other guards watched the exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Johnson, apparently deciding that the situation needed more gasoline on the fire, chose that moment to reassert himself. "Supervisor, this individual has been hostile and uncooperative from the moment." "This individual," Alan interrupted, his voice dropping to the kind of quiet intensity that made boardroom executives reach for their blood pressure medication, "has been standing here for nearly 20 minutes while your security team performs an interpretive dance version of their job responsibilities." Rodriguez actually snorted with laughter, though he quickly disguised it as a cough when Webb's glare turned toward him. Thompson shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his radio as if he might need to call for backup against the dangerous threat posed by a millionaire in a Tom Ford suit. Webb's face had progressed through the entire spectrum of red and was now approaching a shade that suggested either extreme embarrassment or the early stages of a medical emergency. "Mr. Garrity, I'm going to have to ask you to calm down and cooperate with our procedures." "Calm down." Alan's eyebrows rose with the kind of theatrical surprise that would have made a Shakespearean actor proud. "Webb, I've been standing here with the patience of a Buddhist monk while your team conducts what appears to be an audition for a security theater company. I've shown my identification, answered questions about my own address, and submitted to more scrutiny than most people face when applying for government clearance. Exactly which part of this process requires me to be calmer?" The question hung in the humid air like a challenge, and Webb's mouth worked silently as his brain apparently struggled to process the concept of someone who refused to be intimidated by his polyester authority. Machuca seized the moment with the timing of a professional negotiator. "Supervisor, perhaps we should simply follow standard procedure. Mr. Garrity has provided valid identification. His vehicle is registered to his address, and he's clearly a resident. Continuing to detain him without cause could be considered harassment." The word harassment landed like a brick through a stained glass window. Alan watched Webb's expression shift from frustrated authority to genuine alarm as the potential consequences of the situation finally penetrated his ego-clouded judgment. "Officer Machuca," Webb said, his voice taking on a warning tone that suggested she was skating on very thin ice, "I don't appreciate your constant interference in this matter. And I don't appreciate watching my colleagues create liability issues for our employer." She shot back with the kind of professional courage that Alan had rarely seen outside of corporate boardrooms. "The Homeowners Association doesn't pay us to stage confrontations with residents who can afford better lawyers than they can." Johnson's face cycled through several interesting shades of purple. "Are you suggesting that we're—" "I'm suggesting," Machuca interrupted with surgical precision, "that we're about to explain to the board why we detained a resident without cause, wasted emergency response resources, and created a potential discrimination lawsuit that could cost the association more money than most of us will see in our lifetimes." Alan had to admire her technique. Machuca was hitting them with the kind of bureaucratic nightmare scenarios that could make a security supervisor's life very complicated very quickly. The Homeowners Association Board took liability issues seriously, especially when they involved expensive legal complications from residents who could afford to turn minor incidents into federal cases. Webb's jaw worked silently as he processed the implications of Machuca's words. Alan could practically see the gears turning in the supervisor's head as he calculated the potential cost of his power trip against the certain consequences of backing down in front of his subordinates. "Fine," Webb said finally, the word emerging like a tooth being pulled without anesthesia. "Mr. Garrity, you're free to proceed to your residence." Johnson opened the gates. But Alan wasn't quite finished with his morning's entertainment. "Actually, Webb, I think we need to have a conversation about your team's interpretation of security protocols." The supervisor's expression suggested he would rather have a conversation with a root canal specialist, but he managed to maintain his professional facade. "Sir, if you have complaints about our procedures, I encourage you to submit them through proper channels." "I'm not talking about complaints," Alan interrupted, pulling out his smartphone with the deliberate motion of someone unveiling a particularly effective weapon. "I'm talking about documentation." The word hit the assembled guards like a cold shower. Johnson actually took a step backward, as if Alan's phone might be equipped with some sort of accountability ray that could expose his professional inadequacies to public scrutiny. "Documentation." Webb's voice cracked slightly, like a teenager asking someone to prom. "Video documentation," Alan clarified, holding up his phone so everyone could see the red recording light that had been blinking throughout their entire encounter. "Of this conversation, your team's behavior, and the rather creative interpretation of security procedures that we've all witnessed this morning." The silence that followed was so complete that Alan could hear a lawnmower running 3 blocks away. Rodriguez looked like someone had just informed him that his lottery ticket was actually a tax bill, while Thompson appeared to be calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for water, his brain apparently unable to process the concept that his morning power trip had been recorded for posterity. You can't." "Actually, I can," Alan replied with the kind of smile that corporate competitors learned to fear during hostile takeovers. "Georgia is a one-party consent state, which means I'm perfectly within my rights to record conversations in which I'm a participant, especially conversations that take place in public spaces like, say, the entrance to a gated community. Webb's professional composure finally cracked completely, revealing the ugly panic beneath. "Mr. Garrity, I'm sure we can resolve this situation without involving." "Without involving what?" Alan's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made experienced lawyers reach for their retainer agreements. "The board of directors? The local news media? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission? Or perhaps you were thinking of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice?" Each suggestion hit the assembled guards like a physical blow. Alan had just outlined a nightmare scenario that could end careers, destroy reputations, and result in the kind of legal consequences that turned minor incidents into national news stories. Machuca stepped forward again, her professional instincts apparently recognizing that the situation was approaching a point of no return. "Mr. Garrity, perhaps we could discuss this matter privately with Supervisor Webb." But Alan was past the point of diplomatic solutions. 18 months of systematic harassment had finally reached its breaking point, and he was discovering that revenge served at body temperature could be just as satisfying as the cold variety. "Officer Machuca, I appreciate your professionalism throughout this situation," he said, his voice carrying genuine warmth as he addressed her directly. "But I think it's time for your colleagues to understand the consequences of their creative approach to community security." Webb made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Garrity, if you're unhappy with our service, I encourage you to speak with the board. We're always looking for ways to improve." "Oh, I intend to speak with the board," Alan replied, his smile growing wider and considerably less friendly. "In fact, I think they'll be very interested in this video. Patricia Whitman, in particular, should find it educational." The reference to the board president sent a visible shudder through the assembled guards. Whitman was known for her zero-tolerance approach to anything that might reflect poorly on the community's reputation, and a viral video of security guards harassing residents would definitely qualify as a public relations nightmare. Alan continued his verbal dissection with the precision of a forensic accountant. "Of course, the local news stations might also be interested. Channel 2 has been doing a series on discrimination in affluent communities, and this would make excellent supplementary material." Johnson looked like someone had just informed him that his pension fund had been invested in monopoly money. "Sir, please, we were just following procedures." "Whose procedures exactly?" Alan's question cut through Johnson's desperate explanation like a hot knife through butter. "Because I've read the actual security protocols for this community, and nothing in them authorizes detaining residents without cause, conducting vehicle inspections without probable cause, or subjecting homeowners to interrogations that would make airport security blush." The fact that Alan had actually read the community's security procedures clearly came as a shock to everyone present. Webb's expression suggested he was beginning to realize that he had picked a fight with someone who had done his homework, while the other guards looked like students who had just discovered that their teacher had been monitoring their text messages. Machuca seized the moment with the timing of a professional crisis manager. "Supervisor Webb, perhaps we should conclude this matter and allow Mr. Garrity to proceed to his residence. The gates have been open for several minutes now." But Alan wasn't quite finished with his morning's education session. "Actually, there's one more thing we need to discuss." The words fell like a death sentence, and Webb actually flinched as if he'd been struck. "Sir, the systematic pattern of harassment that your team has directed toward minority residents of this community," Alan said, his voice carrying the kind of clinical precision that made jury members pay attention during discrimination trials. "The documented incidents of selective enforcement, the creative interpretation of security protocols, and the rather obvious correlation between a resident's skin color and the level of scrutiny they receive." Webb's face had now progressed beyond the visible spectrum and was approaching a shade that suggested either extreme panic or the early stages of spontaneous combustion. "Mr. Garrity, I can assure you that we don't discriminate." "Then explain Maria Gonzalez," Alan interrupted, referencing his housekeeper whose morning ordeal had started this entire confrontation. "A woman who has been cleaning houses in this community for 3 years, with proper identification and work authorization, who was turned away this morning because your guards decided she didn't belong here." The silence that followed was deafening. Alan could practically hear the sound of legal liability calculations running through Webb's head as the supervisor realized that his team's morning power trip had just escalated into a potential federal case. Or perhaps, Alan continued with the relentless precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "You'd like to explain why my landscaping crew was detained for 2 hours last month while the white contractors working on the Henderson property were waved through without question." Johnson opened his mouth as if to protest, then apparently thought better of it as he realized that anything he said would likely be used against him in the court of public opinion, if not an actual court of law. "The interesting thing about patterns," Alan mused, his voice taking on the contemplative tone of someone discussing an academic subject, "is that they become much more obvious when you document them systematically. Video evidence, witness statements, incident reports, they paint quite a comprehensive picture when assembled by competent legal counsel." Webb's Adam's apple bobbed like a fishing lure as he swallowed hard. "Sir, if there have been irregularities in our procedures, I assure you that we can address them through proper channels." "Oh, we're definitely going to address them," Alan agreed with a smile that would have made a shark nervous. "The question is whether we address them privately, through internal disciplinary measures and policy changes, or publicly, through media attention and federal investigation." The choice he was offering was crystal clear: submit to accountability or face public humiliation. Webb's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his morning power trip had just turned into a career-defining moment, and not in a good way. Machuca stepped forward again, her professional instincts recognizing an opportunity for damage control. "Mr. Garrity, I believe Supervisor Webb is prepared to discuss policy improvements and additional training for the security team." Alan studied Webb's face with the attention of a poker player reading his opponent's tells. The supervisor's carefully cultivated authority had crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane, revealing the small, frightened man beneath the uniform and bluster. "Is that true, Webb?" Alan asked, his voice carrying just enough menace to make the question sound like a final ultimatum. "Are you prepared to discuss meaningful changes to your team's approach to community security?" Webb nodded with the enthusiasm of someone agreeing to avoid a root canal. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. We're always looking for ways to improve our service to the community." "Excellent," Alan replied, though his smile suggested that Webb's problems were just beginning. "Then I'll expect a comprehensive review of your security procedures, mandatory retraining for your entire team, and a formal apology to every resident who has been subjected to discriminatory treatment." The demands landed like hammer blows, each one driving home the scope of the changes that Alan expected. Webb's face cycled through several interesting expressions as he processed the implications of comprehensive reform to his carefully constructed system of selective enforcement. "And if these changes don't occur?" Webb asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alan's smile turned predatory. "Then we'll discuss the matter publicly, with the assistance of legal counsel, media attention, and federal oversight." "Your choice, Webb." The ultimatum hung in the humid air like smoke from a house fire, visible and choking. Alan had just presented the supervisor with a choice between private accountability and public humiliation, and everyone present understood the stakes involved. Webb's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him completely. "Yes, sir. We'll implement whatever changes you feel are necessary." "I'm glad we understand each other," Alan said, finally pocketing his still-recording phone. "Now, I believe you have some gates to open and some procedures to review." As the ornate iron gates finally swung open with mechanical precision, Alan climbed back into his Lamborghini with the satisfaction of someone who had just won the opening round of what promised to be a very interesting battle. But as he drove through the gates toward his mansion, Alan Garrity had no idea that Webb's humiliation was about to become the least of his problems. The supervisor's radio was already crackling to life with an urgent message that would turn the morning's confrontation into the opening salvo of a war that neither man was prepared to fight. The drive from the gates to Alan's mansion should have been a victory lap, a leisurely cruise through perfectly manicured streets lined with houses that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. Instead, it felt like the calm before a hurricane, that eerie stillness when the air pressure drops and every instinct screams that something terrible is approaching. Alan's phone buzzed incessantly against the leather seat, Maria's panicked messages creating a staccato rhythm of notification sounds that grew more urgent with each passing second. He pulled into his circular driveway, the fountain's gentle splash providing an oddly peaceful counterpoint to the chaos brewing around him, and finally answered the call he'd been dreading. "Maria, I'm here," he said, stepping out of the Lamborghini and scanning his property for signs of his missing housekeeper. "Mr. Allen." Her voice crackled through the speaker with the kind of relief usually reserved for rescue operations. "Thank God. I'm hiding behind the Hendersons' poolhouse. They won't let me leave." The words hit Allen like a physical blow. "What do you mean, they won't let you leave?" "The security guards." Maria's voice dropped to a whisper, as if she feared being overheard. "After they turned me away this morning, I tried to walk to the main road to call my daughter for a ride. But they followed me, said I was loitering, and that they had to escort me to the proper authorities." Allen felt his blood pressure spike to dangerous levels. Webb's team hadn't just denied Maria entry to his property. They had essentially imprisoned her within the community, turning Willowbrook Estates into a cage with his employee trapped inside. "Where exactly are you?" Allen asked, already moving toward his garage where his collection of vehicles waited like expensive thoroughbreds. "Behind the Hendersons' poolhouse, near the Rose Garden." "Mr. Allen, I'm scared. One of them has been walking around the property every 10 minutes, looking for me." The image of Maria, a 62-year-old grandmother who cleaned houses to support her family, hiding like a fugitive in a community where she'd worked without incident for 3 years, made Allen's vision blur with rage. Webb's power trip had crossed every line of human decency and professional conduct. "Stay where you are," Allen instructed, climbing into his Range Rover, which would be less conspicuous than the Lamborghini for what he was about to do. "I'm coming to get you." "But Mr. Allen, what if they—" "Maria," Allen's voice carried the kind of absolute certainty that had made him successful in business, "I promise you that no one is going to hurt you. Not today, not ever. Just stay hidden for 5 more minutes." He ended the call and immediately dialed another number, one he'd hoped never to use but had programmed into his phone the day he'd moved to Willowbrook. Detective Rachel Morrison of the Gwinnett County Police Department answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism of someone who had seen enough human stupidity to fill several encyclopedias. "Morrison here. Detective, this is Allen Garrity. We met at the Police Athletic League fundraiser last year." Mr. Garrity, of course. The cybersecurity mogul with the very generous checkbook. "What can I do for you?" Allen had donated $50,000 to the PAL the previous year, partly out of genuine civic spirit and partly because he'd learned that having friends in law enforcement could be invaluable when dealing with situations exactly like this one. "I need your help with a situation at Willowbrook Estates," Allen said, navigating his Range Rover through streets that looked like a Norman Rockwell painting designed by someone with unlimited funds and questionable taste. "Private security guards have unlawfully detained my employee and are refusing to allow her to leave the community." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Are you saying someone is being held against their will?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. A 62-year-old housekeeper who has proper identification and authorization to work in the community was denied entry this morning, then followed and prevented from leaving when she attempted to walk to the main road." "That's false imprisonment," Morrison said, her voice taking on the sharp edge that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "How long has this been going on?" Allen checked his watch and felt his anger spike even higher. 3 hours. 3 hours. Morrison's voice rose an octave. "Mr. Garrity, false imprisonment is a felony in Georgia. If what you're describing is accurate, these security guards are looking at serious criminal charges." "It's accurate," Allen replied grimly. "And I have video documentation of the harassment that led to this situation." "Where are you now?" "About 2 minutes from where they're holding her. I'm going to extract my employee and then we need to have a serious conversation about the security practices in this community." Morrison's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Mr. Garrity, I appreciate your protective instincts, but let me handle the extraction. The last thing we need is for this situation to escalate into something that gets people hurt." Allen wanted to argue, but he recognized the wisdom in Morrison's words. His rage was approaching nuclear levels, and confronting Webb's team while in his current mental state might result in consequences that would make the Morningsgate incident look like a friendly disagreement. "How long until you can get here?" he asked. 15 minutes. "Can you maintain visual contact with your employee without exposing yourself or her to additional risk?" Alan was already pulling into the Hendersons' driveway, the Range Rover's engine purring like a well-fed predator. The house was a sprawling Tudor monstrosity that looked like it had been designed by someone who thought more was always better, with enough gables and dormers to house a small village. "I'm here now," he said, scanning the perfectly manicured grounds for signs of Maria or her captors. "Mr. Garrity, do not approach the security personnel until I arrive. If they've already committed one felony this morning, they might be desperate enough to commit another." The warning sent a chill down Alan's spine as he realized that Webb's team had already crossed the line from harassment into actual criminal conduct. Men who were facing serious jail time might be willing to take desperate measures to avoid consequences. He parked behind the house and moved quickly toward the rose garden, his expensive Italian shoes silent on the perfectly trimmed grass. The Hendersons were apparently away, probably at their place in the Hamptons or their condo in Aspen, which explained why Maria had chosen their property as a hiding place. He found her crouched behind a rose bush that was probably worth more than most people's cars, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled and her dark eyes wide with fear. The sight of this dignified woman, who had always treated his home with such care and respect, reduced to hiding like a criminal, sent Alan's rage past the boiling point and into territory that required new descriptive vocabulary. "Maria," he whispered, dropping to one knee beside her. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, but he could see the tears she was trying to hide. "No, Mr. Allen. Just scared. I've never been in trouble with the law before. My daughter, she'll be so ashamed." "Maria, listen to me," Alan said, his voice gentle despite the fury burning in his chest. "You haven't done anything wrong. Nothing at all. The people who did this to you are the ones who are going to face consequences." "But they said I was trespassing, that I didn't belong here." "They lied," Alan interrupted. "You have every right to be in this community. You work here, you have proper authorization, and you've been coming here for 3 years without any problems. What they did to you is illegal, and they're going to answer for it." Maria's eyes widened as she processed the implications of Alan's words. "Illegal. But they're security guards." "Security guards don't have the authority to imprison people," Alan explained, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining complex concepts to investors. "They can't prevent you from leaving a public area, they can't follow and intimidate you, and they certainly can't hold you against your will." The sound of footsteps on gravel made them both freeze. Alan peered through the rose bushes and felt his blood pressure spike as he recognized Johnson's distinctive waddle. The guard was making another patrol around the Henderson property, his radio crackling with static and his hand resting on the pepper spray canister attached to his belt. Alan's phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morrison, 5 minutes out. "Status." He typed back quickly. "Located employee. Security guard conducting search pattern nearby." Morrison's response was immediate. "Do not engage. Repeat. Do not engage." But as Alan watched Johnson's increasingly aggressive search of the property, he realized that the guard was closing in on their hiding spot. The man was checking behind every bush, every garden structure, every possible hiding place with the methodical precision of someone who had done this before. Maria's hand gripped Alan's arm with surprising strength. "He's coming this way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alan's mind raced through the available options, none of which were particularly attractive. They could try to move to another hiding spot, but that would expose them to discovery. They could wait and hope Johnson missed their location, but the guard's search pattern suggested he was being thorough. Or Alan could step out and confront the man directly, which would likely escalate the situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. The decision was made for him when Johnson's radio crackled to life with Webb's voice, tinged with the kind of panic that suggested the supervisor was beginning to understand the scope of his problems. "Johnson, what's your status on the Gonzalez woman?" "Still searching, sir. She's got to be here somewhere. I've checked most of the grounds. Find her fast. We've got bigger problems. Garrity's been making phone calls, and I just got word that county police are en route." Alan felt a grim smile spread across his face as he realized that Webb was beginning to understand the consequences of his morning power trip. The supervisor's casual racism had just escalated into a criminal investigation, and his carefully constructed kingdom was about to face scrutiny from people who couldn't be intimidated by polyester uniforms and false authority. Johnson's response revealed the depth of his panic. "Police. Sir, what should I do?" "Find the woman and get her off the property. Now. If she's not here when the cops arrive, she can't file a complaint." Alan felt his vision blur with rage as he listened to Webb's instructions. The supervisor was essentially ordering Johnson to complete the kidnapping, to remove Maria from the community entirely so she couldn't serve as evidence of their criminal conduct. Maria's grip on his arm tightened as she heard the exchange. "Mr. Allen," she whispered, "they're going to take me away." "No," Allen replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "They're not." He pulled out his phone and typed a message to Detective Morrison. "Suspect attempting to relocate victim before police arrival. Intervention required immediately." The response was immediate. 2 minutes out. Keep her safe. But 2 minutes felt like an eternity as Johnson's footsteps grew closer. The guard was now only 20 feet away, his search becoming more frantic with each passing second. Alan could hear the man's labored breathing, could practically smell his desperation as he realized that his morning's entertainment was about to become a career-ending disaster. 15 feet. 10 feet. Johnson was now close enough that Alan could hear the guard's muttered curses as he searched behind each rose bush with increasing urgency. 5 feet. Alan made his decision. He stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame rising from behind the rosebush like an avenging angel in a Tom Ford suit. Johnson's face went through several interesting color changes as he realized that his quarry had just become his worst nightmare. "Looking for someone, Johnson?" Alan asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made corporate competitors reach for their lawyers. The guard's mouth worked silently, his brain apparently unable to process the sight of Alan standing protectively in front of Maria like some sort of well-dressed bodyguard. Mr. Garrity," Johnson stammered, his hand moving instinctively toward his radio. We were looking for." "You were looking for my employee, whom you've unlawfully detained for the past 3 hours," Alan interrupted, stepping closer to the guard. "The same employee you've been hunting like a fugitive for the crime of cleaning my house." Johnson's face cycled through several shades of panic as he realized that his morning entertainment had just turned into a potential criminal case. "Sir, she was trespassing." "On whose authority?" Alan's voice cut through Johnson's explanation like a hot knife through butter. "Who gave you the legal right to prevent an authorized worker from leaving this community?" The silence that followed was broken by the distant sound of sirens, growing closer with each passing second. Johnson's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that his career in private security was about to end in a very public and humiliating fashion. "The police are coming, Johnson," Alan said, his smile growing wider and considerably less friendly. "I hope you've been practicing your Miranda rights." The guard's face went white as he realized that his morning power trip was about to become a very expensive legal education. The sirens were getting closer, and Alan could practically hear the sound of handcuffs clicking shut on Johnson's future. But as the first police car rounded the corner, Alan Garrity had no idea that the morning's confrontation was about to explode into something far bigger than a simple case of false imprisonment. Webb's radio was crackling with urgent messages that would turn a local incident into a national story, and the supervisor's next decision would ensure that everyone involved would remember this August morning for the rest of their lives. Detective Rachel Morrison arrived like the cavalry, her unmarked sedan followed by 2 patrol cars that turned the Hendersons' pristine driveway into an impromptu law enforcement convention. She stepped out of her vehicle with the confident stride of someone who had dealt with enough human stupidity to earn a PhD in applied idiocy, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the scene with professional precision. Johnson stood frozen like a deer in headlights, his radio crackling with increasingly frantic messages from Webb that everyone present could hear clearly. The supervisor's voice carried the kind of desperation usually reserved for sinking ship captains or politicians caught in scandals involving farm animals. "Johnson, where are you? The police are here, and they're asking about false imprisonment charges. Get back to the gate immediately." Morrison raised an eyebrow and keyed her own radio. "Dispatch, this is Detective Morrison. I need units to secure the main gate at Willowbrook Estates. Potential flight risk on a felony suspect." Alan helped Maria to her feet, the dignified woman's legs shaking slightly as the adrenaline of the morning's ordeal finally caught up with her. She clutched his arm for support, her dark eyes still wide with the kind of fear that came from being hunted like a criminal for the crime of trying to do her job. "Ma'am," Morrison addressed Maria directly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone experienced in dealing with victims. "I'm Detective Morrison with Gwinnett County Police. Are you Maria Gonzalez?" Maria nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. I clean houses. I work for Mr. Allen. I didn't do anything wrong." "I know you didn't," Morrison replied, shooting a look at Johnson that could have flash-frozen hell. "But I need to ask you some questions about what happened this morning. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" "No, ma'am. Just scared. They said I was trespassing, but I have papers." "We'll get to all of that," Morrison interrupted gently. "First, I need to deal with Officer Johnson here." She turned to the security guard with the expression of someone about to perform exploratory surgery without anesthesia. "Sir, I need you to place your hands behind your back." Johnson's face went through several interesting color changes. "Detective, there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Morrison replied with surgical precision, "is your apparent confusion about the difference between security work and kidnapping. Hands behind your back. Now." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut on Johnson's wrists was oddly satisfying, like the final note in a symphony of justice. The guard's radio continued to crackle with webs. Increasingly panicked messages, each transmission making it clearer that the supervisor understood his carefully constructed kingdom was collapsing. "You have the right to remain silent," Morrison began, her Miranda warning delivered with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Alan found himself genuinely impressed by Morrison's professional competence. She was handling the situation with exactly the kind of no-nonsense authority that Webb's team had pretended to possess, the difference being that hers was backed by actual legal power and genuine training. One of the patrol officers approached Morrison with the kind of urgent expression that suggested developments were occurring faster than anyone could process them. "Detective, we've got a situation at the main gate. The supervisor, Webb I think, is trying to leave the community. Says he has a family emergency." Morrison's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Family emergency. How convenient. Tell the units at the gate that Supervisor Webb is not to leave the community until I've had a chance to interview him. If he resists, arrest him for obstruction." Alan pulled out his phone and showed Morrison the recording he'd made at the gate. "Detective, you might want to see this. It's video documentation of the harassment that led to Maria's imprisonment." Morrison watched the footage with the attention of someone reviewing evidence for a capital case, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. When Johnson's voice on the recording demanded that Alan exit his vehicle for a brief inspection, she actually winced. "Mr. Garrity," she said after watching the entire confrontation, "this is textbook harassment based on racial profiling. Combined with the false imprisonment of Ms. Gonzalez, we're looking at multiple felony charges." "There's more," Alan replied, scrolling through his phone to show Morrison the documented incidents from the past 18 months. Screenshots of text messages, photographs of harassment incidents, witness statements from neighbors. This wasn't an isolated occurrence. It was a pattern of systematic discrimination. Morrison studied the evidence with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. "Mr. Garrity, you've essentially built a federal civil rights case. Have you considered contacting the Department of Justice?" The question hung in the humid air like a challenge. Alan had considered it, of course, but he'd hoped to resolve the situation through local channels. Now, watching Johnson being loaded into a patrol car while Webb's panicked radio messages continued to broadcast his guilt to anyone within earshot, he realized that local solutions were no longer adequate. "I was hoping to handle this internally," Alan admitted. "But after this morning's escalation, I think federal oversight might be necessary." Morrison nodded grimly. "I'll make sure my report includes a recommendation for DOJ review. This kind of systematic discrimination in a gated community could have implications far beyond Willowbrook Estates." Maria tugged gently on Alan's sleeve, her voice still shaky but gaining strength. "Mr. Allen, what happens now? Will I lose my job? The other families I work for?" "Maria," Allen said, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "you're not going to lose anything. If anything, you're going to be compensated for the trauma you've endured this morning. And every family in this community is going to understand that what happened to you was criminal behavior, not legitimate security work." Morrison stepped closer, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she addressed Maria directly. "Ma'am, I need you to know that you're the victim in this situation, not the perpetrator. What these men did to you was illegal, and they're going to face serious consequences. You have every right to be in this community, and no one, security guard or otherwise, has the authority to imprison you." The sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of additional complications. A news van from Channel 2 pulled up behind the police cars, followed by what appeared to be reporters from at least 2 other local stations. Someone had apparently leaked information about the arrests at Willowbrook Estates, and the media was responding with the enthusiasm of sharks detecting blood in the water. Allen felt a grim satisfaction as he realized that Webb's worst nightmare was about to come true. The supervisor's systematic harassment had just become a public relations disaster that would make national headlines, and every detail of Willowbrook's discriminatory security practices was about to be exposed to public scrutiny. Morrison noticed the media presence with the resignation of someone who had dealt with high-profile cases before. "Mr. Garrity, you might want to prepare for some media attention. Stories involving racial discrimination in affluent communities tend to generate significant coverage." "I'm not afraid of media attention," Allen replied, watching reporters set up their equipment with professional efficiency. "The truth needs to be told, and if it takes national coverage to ensure that other communities don't engage in similar practices, then so be it." His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Patricia Whitman, the board president whose tacit support had enabled Webb's harassment campaign. Allen almost smiled as he realized that the community's leadership was beginning to understand the scope of their liability. "Mr. Garrity," Whitman's voice carried the kind of panic usually reserved for people who had just discovered their house was on fire. "I've just heard about some sort of incident at the gate. Surely we can resolve this matter internally." "Mrs. Whitman," Allen interrupted, his voice carrying the cold precision of a surgeon making an incision. "Your security team just committed multiple felonies, including false imprisonment and civil rights violations. There is no internal resolution for criminal behavior." "But surely you understand that involving the media." "I understand that your board's tacit approval of discriminatory security practices just became a very expensive legal liability," Allen replied. "I also understand that you're about to discover what happens when systematic racism meets actual consequences." He ended the call without waiting for Whitman's response, turning his attention to the approaching reporters with the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to hide and everything to gain from public exposure. The first reporter to reach him was Amanda Chen from Channel 2, a sharp-eyed journalist who had built her reputation on exposing corruption and discrimination in affluent communities. Her cameraman was already rolling as she approached, and Allen could see the recognition in her eyes as she realized she had stumbled onto a major story. "Mr. Garrity," Chen said, her voice carrying the professional urgency of someone who sensed a career-defining scoop, "can you tell us what happened here this morning?" Allen straightened his burgundy suit jacket and looked directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who had faced down hostile boardrooms and emerged victorious. "This morning, private security guards at Willowbrook Estates committed multiple crimes, including false imprisonment of my housekeeper and systematic harassment based on racial discrimination. The evidence has been turned over to law enforcement, and I expect federal civil rights investigators to become involved." Chen's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a reporter who had just discovered a Pulitzer Prize-worthy story. "Are you saying that security guards in this exclusive community have been targeting residents and workers based on race?" "I'm saying that I have 18 months of documented evidence showing a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement," Allen replied, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Video recordings, witness statements, and incident reports that demonstrate systematic civil rights violations." The implications of Allen's statement hit the assembled reporters like an earthquake. Stories about racial discrimination in affluent communities were media gold, the kind of coverage that could make careers and destroy reputations with equal efficiency. Morrison stepped forward, recognizing that the situation was rapidly expanding beyond a simple criminal case into something with much broader implications. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an ongoing criminal investigation. While I appreciate your interest, I need to ask you to maintain a respectful distance while we complete our interviews with witnesses. But the damage was already done. Allen's public statement had just turned a local incident into a potential national story, and every news outlet in Atlanta would be scrambling to get additional coverage before the evening broadcasts. His phone began ringing incessantly as the story spread through social media and professional networks. Legal colleagues, business associates, and community activists were all calling to offer support, advice, or simply to express their outrage at what had occurred. One call stood out from the others. Dr. James Patterson from the Southern Poverty Law Center, an organization that specialized in combating systemic discrimination and hate crimes. Mr. Garrity, Patterson's voice carried the kind of professional urgency that suggested he was already mobilizing resources. I've just seen the news coverage of this morning's incident. The SPLC would like to offer our assistance in ensuring that this matter receives appropriate federal attention. Allen felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized that his morning confrontation was about to become part of a much larger battle against systematic discrimination. Dr. Patterson, I appreciate your offer. This community needs to understand that racist security practices have serious consequences. Mr. Garrity, based on what I've seen so far, Willowbrook Estates may be just the tip of the iceberg. We've been tracking similar patterns in gated communities across the Southeast, and your evidence could be the key to exposing a much broader problem. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another patrol car, this one containing a very subdued-looking Webb in handcuffs. The supervisor's carefully cultivated authority had completely evaporated, leaving behind a small, frightened man who was beginning to understand that his morning power trip was going to cost him everything he'd built. As Morrison began processing the second arrest, Allen realized that his morning confrontation had just become something far more significant than a personal dispute. The systematic discrimination he'd endured had finally met its match in the form of actual consequences, and Webb's carefully constructed kingdom of casual racism was about to face scrutiny from people who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. But as the reporters continued their coverage and the police completed their investigation, Allen had no idea that the morning's events were about to trigger a chain reaction that would expose similar practices in communities across the country. His decision to fight back had just lit a fuse that would explode far beyond the gates of Willowbrook Estates. The revolution, as they say, would be televised. By noon, the story had exploded across social media with the force of a digital wildfire. #WillowbrookGates was trending nationally on Twitter, Instagram stories were flooded with outrage-fueled commentary, and TikTok videos analyzing Allen's confrontation with the security team had already garnered millions of views. The cell phone footage he'd recorded was being dissected frame by internet detectives, legal analysts, and social justice advocates who recognized the incident as a perfect crystallization of systemic racism in America's most exclusive enclaves. Allen stood in his home office, watching the coverage unfold on multiple screens like a general monitoring a battle from his command center. CNN had picked up the story, Fox News was already spinning it into a broader narrative about property rights versus civil liberties, and MSNBC was preparing a primetime special on discrimination in gated communities. The morning's confrontation had become a national conversation about race, privilege, and accountability in less time than it took most people to eat lunch. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the arrests. Legal scholars from Harvard and Yale were calling to offer expert testimony. Civil rights organizations were volunteering resources for what they saw as a landmark case. Hollywood talent agents were inquiring about movie rights, apparently convinced that Allen's story had blockbuster potential. The most interesting call had come from Senator Patricia Williams, Georgia's first black female senator and a longtime advocate for civil rights legislation. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of fighting battles that most people didn't even know were being waged. "Mr. Garrity," she'd said, "what happened to you this morning represents something much larger than a local dispute. The systematic discrimination you've documented could be the catalyst for federal legislation addressing civil rights violations in private communities." Allen had listened with growing amazement as the senator outlined the scope of what his morning confrontation might accomplish. Federal oversight of private security forces. mandatory civil rights training for community associations, financial penalties for discriminatory practices that were severe enough to actually change behavior. "Senator," Alan had replied, "this morning I just wanted to get into my own house. I had no idea it would become a federal case." Mr. Garrity, sometimes the most important battles begin with people who just want to be treated with basic human dignity. Your decision to document and resist this harassment has given us the evidence we need to address a problem that affects thousands of communities across the country. Now, as Alan watched the coverage continue to expand, he realized that his morning's confrontation had triggered something far beyond his original intentions. The systematic discrimination he'd endured had finally met its match in the form of public outrage, legal accountability, and media attention that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Maria sat in his living room, giving her statement to a prosecutor from the district attorney's office who specialized in civil rights cases. The transformation in her demeanor had been remarkable to witness. The frightened woman who had hidden behind rose bushes that morning had become an articulate, determined victim who understood that her testimony could help prevent others from experiencing similar treatment. "They made me feel like a criminal," she was saying, her voice growing stronger with each word. "For 3 years, I cleaned houses in this community. I had proper identification, work authorization, everything. But this morning, they treated me like I was some kind of threat just because of how I look." The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres who had built her reputation on winning impossible cases, nodded as she took detailed notes. "Mrs. Gonzalez, your experience represents a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement. The evidence Mr. Garrity has provided shows that security guards in this community have been targeting minorities for months." Alan's doorbell chimed with the subtle elegance that $8.2 million could buy, and he opened it to find Theola Machuca standing on his doorstep in civilian clothes. She looked nervous but determined, like someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. "Mr. Garrity," she said, "I hope you don't mind me coming by. I wanted to speak with you about what happened this morning." Alan invited her in, curious about what the only professional member of Webb's security team might have to say. Machuca had been the sole voice of reason during the morning's confrontation, and her willingness to challenge Webb's authority had impressed everyone who witnessed it. "Officer Machuca," Alan began, but she held up her hand to stop him. "Just Theola, please. I'm no longer employed by Willowbrook Estate Security. I resigned about an hour ago." Alan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Because of this morning's incident?" Machuca's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "Because of every morning for the past 8 months. Mr. Garrity, what you experienced today was just the visible tip of a very large iceberg. Webb's team has been engaging in discriminatory practices since I started working here, and this morning was simply the first time someone with your resources was in a position to document it." She pulled out a folder that looked like it had been assembled with the precision of a legal brief. "I've been keeping my own documentation of questionable incidents. Photographs, incident reports, witness statements from residents who were afraid to come forward. I was planning to take this to the board eventually, but after this morning, I realized that internal channels weren't going to be sufficient." Alan examined the contents of the folder with growing amazement. Machuca had essentially built a parallel case against her own employer, documenting dozens of incidents that demonstrated a clear pattern of racial profiling and discriminatory enforcement. "Theola," he said, using her first name as she'd requested, "this is incredible work. Why didn't you bring this forward sooner?" Her smile was sad and knowing. "Mr. Garrity, you're a millionaire with connections, resources, and the ability to fight back. Most of the people who are being harassed are housekeepers, landscapers, delivery drivers, people who can't afford to lose their jobs by making waves. I was documenting everything, hoping to find a way to address the problem without destroying the livelihoods of the people I was trying to protect." The implications of her words hit Alan like a physical blow. He had assumed that his experience was unique, that his wealth and status had made him a particular target for Webb's harassment. Instead, he was learning that he was simply the most visible victim of a systematic campaign that had been targeting vulnerable workers for months. "How many people?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Based on my documentation, at least 40 separate incidents involving minority workers or residents over the past 8 months," Machuca replied. Most of them never filed complaints because they were afraid of retaliation. Alan felt his anger shift from personal outrage to something deeper and more determined. Webb's harassment hadn't just been about humiliating a successful black man. It had been about maintaining a system of intimidation that kept an entire class of people in line through fear. His phone buzzed with another call, this one from an unexpected source. Dr. Amara Johnson, a sociology professor at Emory University who had spent her career studying residential segregation and housing discrimination. Mr. Garrity, Dr. Johnson's voice carried the excitement of an academic who had just discovered a perfect case study. I've been following the coverage of this morning's incident, and I believe what you've experienced represents a textbook example of what we call exclusionary gatekeeping in affluent communities. Exclusionary gatekeeping? The use of private security forces to maintain racial and economic segregation through selective enforcement and intimidation tactics, Dr. Johnson explained. It's a way for exclusive communities to maintain their desired demographic composition without explicitly violating fair housing laws. Alan listened with growing fascination as Dr. Johnson outlined the broader context of his morning's experience. According to her research, communities like Willowbrook Estates often employed security practices that were specifically designed to make minorities feel unwelcome, even when they had every legal right to be there. The genius of the system, Dr. Johnson continued, is that it operates through 1,000 small humiliations rather than outright exclusion. Death by 1,000 cuts, if you will. Most people eventually give up and move somewhere else rather than endure the constant harassment. But I didn't give up, Alan said. No, you didn't. And that's what makes your case so significant. You had the resources to fight back, the sophistication to document everything, and the courage to escalate when diplomatic solutions failed. Your resistance has exposed a system that usually operates in the shadows. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Patricia Whitman stood at Alan's door looking like someone who had aged several years in the span of a few hours. The board president's usual air of entitled authority had been replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Mr. Garrity, she began, her voice carrying the desperate sweetness of someone trying to prevent a complete disaster. I hope we can discuss this situation like reasonable adults. Alan invited her in, curious to hear what the woman who had enabled Webb's harassment would have to say now that federal investigators were involved. Whitman's discomfort was palpable as she entered his home, her eyes taking in the obvious signs of wealth and success that made her morning's condescension seem even more ridiculous in hindsight. Mrs. Whitman, Alan said, his voice carrying polite formality. I assume you're here to discuss the liability issues facing the Homeowners Association. Whitman's careful composure cracked slightly. Mr. Garrity, surely we can resolve this matter without involving federal authorities. The board is prepared to make significant changes to our security procedures. What kind of changes? Alan interrupted, genuinely curious about what the woman thought might be adequate to address systematic civil rights violations. Well, Whitman stammered, clearly unprepared for direct questions. Additional training for the security staff, revised protocols, perhaps some diversity initiatives. Mrs. Whitman, Alan's voice took on the patient tone he used when explaining basic concepts to particularly slow investors. Your security team committed multiple felonies this morning. They falsely imprisoned an innocent woman, engaged in systematic harassment based on racial profiling, and violated the civil rights of numerous residents and workers. The time for training programs and diversity initiatives was 18 months ago, before your tacit approval enabled this behavior to escalate. Whitman's face cycled through several interesting color changes as she processed the implications of Alan's words. Mr. Garrity, I want you to know that the board never intended for. Intent is irrelevant, Alan interrupted. Impact is what matters. And the impact of your board's policies has been to create an environment where minorities are systematically harassed and intimidated. That's not an accident or an oversight. That's institutional racism with a homeowners association letterhead. The silence that followed was broken by Machuca clearing her throat diplomatically. Mrs. Whitman, perhaps you should know that I've provided documentation of 43 separate incidents of discriminatory enforcement over the past 8 months. The federal investigators are going to have a very comprehensive picture of the systematic nature of these violations. Whitman's face went white as she realized that the problem was far worse than she had imagined. 43 incidents. But surely there must be some mistake. No mistake, Machuca replied firmly. Detailed documentation, including photographs, witness statements, and incident reports. I kept meticulous records because I knew that eventually, someone would need to be held accountable. Alan watched Whitman's world collapse with the satisfaction of someone witnessing long overdue justice. The woman who had dismissed his concerns with condescending platitudes about community safety was finally understanding that her enabling of Webb's harassment had created a massive legal liability. His phone buzzed with yet another call, this one from a number he didn't recognize but which his caller ID identified as coming from Washington, D.C. He answered to find himself speaking with Special Agent Marcus Thompson from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Mr. Garrity, Agent Thompson's voice carried the professional authority of someone who investigated federal crimes for a living. I've been reviewing the evidence from this morning's incident, and I believe we need to discuss expanding this investigation beyond the immediate perpetrators. Alan felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized that his morning confrontation was about to become part of a much larger federal investigation. Agent Thompson, I have extensive documentation of systematic discrimination, and I've just learned that there were at least 40 additional incidents involving other victims. Mr. Garrity, based on the preliminary evidence, it appears that Willowbrook Estates may be operating what we classify as a pattern or practice of civil rights violations. That puts this case under federal jurisdiction and opens up the possibility of significant legal consequences for everyone involved in enabling this behavior. As Alan listened to Agent Thompson outline the scope of the federal investigation, he realized that his morning's decision to fight back had triggered something far beyond his original intentions. The systematic discrimination he'd endured had finally met its match in the form of federal oversight, and Webb's carefully constructed kingdom of casual racism was about to face scrutiny from people with the authority to impose real consequences. But as the afternoon continued to unfold, Alan had no idea that the federal investigation would uncover connections to similar practices in communities across multiple states. His decision to document and resist Webb's harassment was about to expose a network of discriminatory security practices that reached far beyond the gates of Willowbrook Estates. The revolution was accelerating, and there was no going back now. What do you think drives communities like Willowbrook to maintain these discriminatory practices even when they know they're illegal? Share your thoughts on whether real change is possible when the consequences finally catch up with institutional racism. The federal investigation moved with the swift efficiency of a well-oiled machine designed to dismantle systematic oppression. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, Special Agent Thompson had arrived at Willowbrook Estates with a team of investigators that transformed the community's pristine clubhouse into a temporary command center for what was rapidly becoming the largest civil rights investigation in Georgia's recent history. Alan found himself at the epicenter of a legal earthquake that was reshaping not just his community, but potentially dozens of similar enclaves across the Southeast. The FBI had discovered that Webb's discriminatory practices weren't an isolated phenomenon. They were part of what investigators were calling a franchise model of exclusionary security that had been quietly implemented in affluent communities from Virginia to Florida. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Security companies with names like Heritage Protection Services and Traditional Community Safety had been marketing their services to gated communities with carefully coded language that promised to maintain community standards and preserve property values. What they were actually selling was a systematic approach to racial intimidation that operated just below the threshold of obvious illegality. Agent Thompson spread a map across Alan's dining room table that looked like an epidemiologist tracking a disease outbreak. Red pins marked communities where similar complaints had been filed, yellow pins indicated locations where investigations were pending, and green pins showed places where federal oversight had already been implemented. Mr. Garrity, Thompson said, his finger tracing patterns across the Southeast that revealed the true scope of the problem. Your experience at Willowbrook appears to be part of a coordinated effort to maintain racial segregation in affluent communities through private security harassment. Alan studied the map with growing amazement. There were hundreds of pins scattered across multiple states, each one representing a community where minorities had faced systematic harassment disguised as legitimate security procedures. How is this possible? Alan asked. How did this operate for so long without federal intervention? Thompson's smile was grim. Because the victims were typically people without the resources to fight back. Housekeepers, landscapers, delivery drivers, construction workers. People who depended on access to these communities for their livelihoods. Most of them endured the harassment rather than risk losing their jobs. The explanation hit Alan like a physical blow as he realized how his wealth and status had made him an anomaly. He'd been able to document, resist, and escalate because he had resources that most victims lacked. His privilege had inadvertently become the key to exposing a system designed to remain invisible. Machuca entered the room carrying another folder, this one even thicker than her previous documentation. Agent Thompson, I've been in contact with security personnel from other communities in the network. 3 more officers have come forward with similar documentation. She spread the contents of the new folder across the table, revealing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that stretched across state lines. Photographs of harassment incidents, copies of training materials that used coded language to encourage racial profiling, and internal communications that made Webb's casual racism look sophisticated by comparison. This training manual, Thompson said, holding up a document that looked like it had been designed by someone with a PhD in systematic oppression, explicitly instructs security personnel to use enhanced screening procedures for what it calls non-traditional community members. Alan examined the manual with growing disgust. The language was carefully crafted to avoid explicit racial references while making the intended targets crystal clear. Non-traditional community members meant minorities. Enhanced screening meant harassment. Community safety protocols meant intimidation tactics designed to make people feel unwelcome. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from someone he'd never expected to hear from. Governor Brian Kemp's office. The governor's chief of staff, a man named Robert Hayes who sounded like he'd been dealing with political crises since before Alan was born, delivered a message that crystallized just how far the morning's confrontation had reached. Mr. Garrity, the governor has been following the developments at Willowbrook Estates, and he wants you to know that the state of Georgia takes these civil rights violations very seriously. He's prepared to support federal intervention and push for state legislation that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Alan found himself impressed by the governor's quick response. Politicians usually moved with all the urgency of glaciers, but the national attention on Willowbrook had apparently motivated unprecedented speed in addressing the problem. Governor Kemp is also prepared to call for a comprehensive review of private security practices in gated communities throughout Georgia, Hayes continued. Your documentation of systematic discrimination has exposed a problem that we believe affects hundreds of communities across the state. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of what appeared to be half the legal profession of Atlanta. Civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors, and legal scholars had descended on Willowbrook like an army of accountability, each one recognizing that Alan's case represented the kind of landmark opportunity that could reshape how discrimination was addressed in private communities. The most impressive arrival was Johnny Cochran Jr.'s former law partner, a legendary civil rights attorney named Charles Hamilton who had spent 4 decades fighting battles that most people didn't even know were being waged. Hamilton's presence alone was enough to send ripples of panic through every homeowners association in the Southeast. Mr. Garrity, Hamilton said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from winning cases that changed history. What happened to you this morning represents something much larger than a local dispute. The systematic discrimination you've documented could be the foundation for a class action lawsuit that affects thousands of victims across multiple states. Alan listened with growing amazement as Hamilton outlined the scope of what his morning confrontation might accomplish. A federal class action lawsuit that could force systematic reforms across the entire private security industry. Financial penalties severe enough to actually change behavior rather than simply serving as a cost of doing business. Federal oversight that would prevent these practices from simply moving to other communities. Mr. Hamilton, Alan said, this morning I just wanted to get into my own house. I had no idea it would become a federal civil rights case. Hamilton's laugh was rich with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Mr. Garrity, the most important civil rights victories often begin with people who simply refuse to accept being treated as second-class citizens. Your decision to document and resist this harassment has given us the evidence we need to dismantle a system that has been operating in the shadows for years. The afternoon brought a steady stream of developments that transformed Allen's home into an impromptu headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a national civil rights campaign. Reporters were camped outside his gates, federal agents were processing evidence in his living room, and civil rights organizations were phenomenon. They were part of what investigators were calling a franchise model of exclusionary security that had been quietly implemented in affluent communities from Virginia to Florida. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Security companies with names like Heritage Protection Services and Traditional Community Safety had been marketing their services to gated communities with carefully coded language that promised to maintain community standards and preserve property values. What they were actually selling was a systematic approach to racial intimidation that operated just below the threshold of obvious illegality. Agent Thompson spread a map across Allen's dining room table that looked like an epidemiologist tracking a disease outbreak. Red pins marked communities where similar complaints had been filed, yellow pins indicated locations where investigations were pending, and green pins showed places where federal oversight had already been implemented. Mr. Garrity, Thompson said, his finger tracing patterns across the southeast that revealed the true scope of the problem. Your experience at Willowbrook appears to be part of a coordinated effort to maintain racial segregation in affluent communities through private security harassment. Allen studied the map with growing amazement. There were hundreds of pins scattered across multiple states, each one representing a community where minorities had faced systematic harassment disguised as legitimate security procedures. How is this possible? Allen asked. How did this operate for so long without federal intervention? Thompson's smile was grim. Because the victims were typically people without the resources to fight back. Housekeepers, landscapers, delivery drivers, construction workers. People who depended on access to these communities for their livelihoods. Most of them endured the harassment rather than risk losing their jobs. The explanation hit Allen like a physical blow as he realized how his wealth and status had made him an anomaly. He'd been able to document, resist, and escalate because he had resources that most victims lacked. His privilege had inadvertently become the key to exposing a system designed to remain invisible. Machuca entered the room carrying another folder, this one even thicker than her previous documentation. Agent Thompson, I've been in contact with security personnel from other communities in the network. 3 more officers have come forward with similar documentation. She spread the contents of the new folder across the table, revealing a pattern of discriminatory enforcement that stretched across state lines. Photographs of harassment incidents, copies of training materials that used coded language to encourage racial profiling, and internal communications that made Webb's casual racism look sophisticated by comparison. This training manual, Thompson said, holding up a document that looked like it had been designed by someone with a PhD in systematic oppression, explicitly instructs security personnel to use enhanced screening procedures for what it calls non-traditional community members. Allen examined the manual with growing disgust. The language was carefully crafted to avoid explicit racial references while making the intended targets crystal clear. Non-traditional community members meant minorities. Enhanced screening meant harassment. Community safety protocols meant intimidation tactics designed to make people feel unwelcome. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from someone he'd never expected to hear from. Governor Brian Kemp's office. The governor's chief of staff, a man named Robert Hayes who sounded like he'd been dealing with political crises since before Allen was born, delivered a message that crystallized just how far the morning's confrontation had reached. Mr. Garrity, the governor has been following the developments at Willowbrook Estates, and he wants you to know that the state of Georgia takes these civil rights violations very seriously. He's prepared to support federal intervention and push for state legislation that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Allen found himself impressed by the governor's quick response. Politicians usually moved with all the urgency of glaciers, but the national attention on Willowbrook had apparently motivated unprecedented speed in addressing the problem. Governor Kemp is also prepared to call for a comprehensive review of private security practices in gated communities throughout Georgia, Hayes continued. Your documentation of systematic discrimination has exposed a problem that we believe affects hundreds of communities across the state. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of what appeared to be half the legal profession of Atlanta. Civil rights attorneys, federal prosecutors, and legal scholars had descended on Willowbrook like an army of accountability, each one recognizing that Allen's case represented the kind of landmark opportunity that could reshape how discrimination was addressed in private communities. The most impressive arrival was Johnny Cochran Jr.'s former law partner, a legendary civil rights attorney named Charles Hamilton who had spent 4 decades fighting battles that most people didn't even know were being waged. Hamilton's presence alone was enough to send ripples of panic through every homeowners association in the Southeast. "Mr. Garrity," Hamilton said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from winning cases that changed history, "what happened to you this morning represents something much larger than a local dispute. The systematic discrimination you've documented could be the foundation for a class action lawsuit that affects thousands of victims across multiple states." Allen listened with growing amazement as Hamilton outlined the scope of what his morning confrontation might accomplish. A federal class action lawsuit that could force systematic reforms across the entire private security industry. Financial penalties severe enough to actually change behavior rather than simply serving as a cost of doing business. Federal oversight that would prevent these practices from simply moving to other communities. "Mr. Hamilton," Allen said, "this morning I just wanted to get into my own house. I had no idea it would become a federal civil rights case." Hamilton's laugh was rich with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice triumph over seemingly impossible odds. "Mr. Garrity, the most important civil rights victories often begin with people who simply refuse to accept being treated as second-class citizens. Your decision to document and resist this harassment has given us the evidence we need to dismantle a system that has been operating in the shadows for years." The afternoon brought a steady stream of developments that transformed Allen's home into an impromptu headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a national civil rights campaign. Reporters were camped outside his gates, federal agents were processing evidence in his living room, and civil rights organizations were coordinating strategy sessions in his kitchen. The most significant development came when Agent Thompson received a call that made his eyebrows rise to dangerous heights. He listened intently for several minutes, occasionally making notes that looked increasingly urgent. "Mr. Garrity," Thompson said after ending the call, "we just received information that's going to escalate this investigation significantly. It appears that the security company training these discriminatory practices has connections to organizations with ties to white supremacist groups." The silence that followed was deafening. Allen felt his blood run cold as he realized that his morning's harassment hadn't just been about maintaining property values or community standards. It had been about something much darker and more dangerous. White supremacist connections. Allen's voice was barely above a whisper. "Financial connections, shared personnel, coordinated training programs," Thompson explained grimly. "What we're looking at isn't just discriminatory security practices. It's a systematic effort to maintain racial segregation through intimidation and harassment." Machuca leaned forward, her professional training evident in the sharp questions she immediately began asking. "Agent Thompson, does this mean the federal investigation is being elevated to domestic terrorism status?" "It means," Thompson replied carefully, "that we're now looking at potential violations of federal hate crime statutes in addition to civil rights violations." The scope of this investigation just expanded significantly. Allen's phone immediately began ringing with calls from national media outlets who had apparently been monitoring law enforcement communications. CNN wanted to schedule an interview. The New York Times was sending reporters. 60 Minutes was interested in a feature story that would expose similar practices nationwide. The most unexpected call came from someone Allen had never heard of but whom Agent Thompson immediately recognized. Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division and one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the country. "Mr. Garrity," Dr. Chen's voice carried the authority of someone who had prosecuted some of the most significant civil rights cases of the past decade. "I want to personally thank you for your courage in documenting and reporting these violations. Your evidence has given us the foundation we need to address a problem that has been affecting communities nationwide." "Dr. Chen," Allen replied, still struggling to process the scope of what his morning confrontation had unleashed, "I hope this investigation can prevent other people from experiencing what I went through." "Mr. Garrity, I believe this investigation will do much more than that. Based on the evidence we've collected so far, we're looking at potential criminal charges against multiple individuals across several states, federal oversight of private security practices, and civil penalties that could reach into the hundreds of millions of dollars." The implications of Dr. Chen's words began to sink in as Alan realized that his morning's decision to fight back had triggered something far beyond his original intentions. The systematic discrimination he'd endured had finally met its match in the form of federal prosecution, and the carefully constructed network of exclusionary security practices was about to face scrutiny from people with the authority to impose real consequences. But as the afternoon continued to unfold with development after development, Alan had no idea that the federal investigation was about to uncover evidence that would make the morning's confrontation look like a minor skirmish in a much larger war. The network of discriminatory security practices extended far beyond private communities, reaching into corporate security, municipal police departments, and even federal law enforcement agencies. His decision to document Webb's harassment had lit a fuse that was about to expose systematic racism at every level of American society, and the explosion was going to reshape how civil rights were protected and enforced across the entire country. The revolution had gone national, and there was no containing it now. As evening approached, Alan stood in his home office looking out at the media encampment that had transformed his quiet street into something resembling a presidential campaign headquarters. Satellite trucks lined Magnolia Drive, reporters were conducting live broadcasts from his front lawn, and federal agents were processing evidence that would reshape civil rights enforcement for decades to come. His phone buzzed with one final call of the day, this one from a number that made his heart skip a beat. The White House. The president's civil rights advisor wanted to discuss federal legislation that would address discriminatory practices in private communities nationwide. As Alan prepared to take the call that would make his morning confrontation part of national policy, he realized that sometimes the most important battles began with someone simply refusing to accept being treated as less than fully human. His decision to fight back hadn't just exposed Webb's harassment, it had illuminated a network of systematic oppression that reached into every corner of American society. The gates of Willowbrook Estates had become the symbol of something much larger than one community's discriminatory practices. They had become the focal point of a national conversation about race, privilege, and the courage required to demand equal treatment under the law. And Alan Garrity, who had simply wanted to get into his own house that morning, had become the catalyst for the most significant civil rights investigation in a generation. 3 weeks after the morning that changed everything, Alan stood before a joint session of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver testimony that would reshape federal civil rights law. The marble-columned hearing room was packed with representatives, senators, civil rights advocates, and enough media to cover a presidential inauguration. The wooden witness table where he sat had hosted some of the most significant civil rights testimony in American history, and now it was his turn to add another chapter to that legacy. The investigation had moved with unprecedented speed and scope. What began as a local incident at Willowbrook Estates had metastasized into a federal probe that spanned 17 states and implicated over 200 private security companies. The FBI had uncovered what they were now calling Operation Gatekeep, a systematic network of discriminatory security practices that had been quietly segregating affluent communities for over a decade. Webb and Johnson were already in federal custody, facing charges that included conspiracy to violate civil rights, false imprisonment, and domestic terrorism. The security company that had trained them, Heritage Protection Services, had been revealed as a front organization with direct financial ties to 3 separate white supremacist groups. Their training manuals, which had seemed merely offensive to Alan 3 weeks ago, were now evidence in what prosecutors were calling the largest civil rights conspiracy since the 1960s. Mr. Garrity, Committee Chairman Representative James Lewis began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. Please tell this committee, in your own words, what happened on the morning of August 15, 2024. Alan adjusted the microphone and looked directly into the C-SPAN cameras that were broadcasting his testimony live to millions of Americans. He had testified before congressional committees on cybersecurity matters, but this was different. This wasn't about technology or business. This was about the fundamental promise of equality that America had been struggling to fulfill for centuries. Chairman Lewis, Alan began, his voice carrying the calm authority he developed through years of high-stakes presentations. That morning, I was denied entry to my own $8.2 million home because security guards decided that my skin color made me a threat to community safety. What I discovered over the following hours was that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic campaign to maintain racial segregation through intimidation and harassment. He paused as cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes, then continued with the kind of detailed precision that had made him successful in business. The evidence we've provided to this committee shows that over 300 communities across 17 states were using similar discriminatory practices. Thousands of minorities were subjected to harassment, false imprisonment, and civil rights violations, all disguised as legitimate security procedures. Senator Patricia Williams, who had become a key ally in pushing for federal legislation, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had spent decades fighting these battles. Mr. Garrity, you mentioned that most victims lacked the resources to fight back. Can you explain how your unique position helped expose this network? Allen nodded grimly. Senator Williams, I had 3 advantages that most victims lacked: wealth, legal sophistication, and the ability to absorb retaliation without losing my livelihood. Most of the people being harassed were housekeepers, landscapers, and service workers who couldn't afford to challenge the system without risking their jobs. My privilege became the key to exposing discrimination that had been hidden in plain sight. The testimony continued for 3 hours, with Allen providing detailed evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic oppression. Video recordings, training manuals, financial records, and witness statements combined to create an undeniable case that private security companies had been weaponizing fear to maintain racial segregation in America's most affluent communities. The most damning evidence came from Theola Machuca, who had testified earlier that morning about the internal culture of discrimination she had witnessed. Her documentation of 43 separate incidents had provided federal investigators with a roadmap for uncovering similar practices nationwide. Mr. Garrity, Representative Sarah Mitchell from Texas asked, what specific legislative changes would you recommend to prevent these practices from continuing? Allen had been preparing for this question for weeks, working with civil rights attorneys and policy experts to develop recommendations that would actually change behavior rather than simply creating new paperwork requirements. Representative Mitchell, I recommend 4 specific changes, Allen replied, counting off on his fingers with the precision of someone who had thought this through carefully. First, federal licensing and oversight of private security companies serving residential communities. Second, mandatory civil rights training with annual recertification. Third, financial penalties severe enough to make discrimination economically devastating rather than just expensive. And fourth, federal monitoring of communities with histories of discriminatory practices. The recommendations landed like hammer blows in the hearing room. Allen was essentially proposing federal oversight of an industry that had operated with minimal regulation for decades, and the implications for private communities across the country were staggering. Senator Robert Hayes from Florida, who had been notably skeptical throughout the hearings, leaned forward with the expression of someone who had found a flaw in Allen's argument. Mr. Garrity, don't you think federal oversight of private communities represents government overreach? These are private associations with the right to establish their own security procedures. Allen had been expecting this question and had prepared for it with the kind of thorough research that had made Gartec Solutions successful. Senator Hayes, private communities don't have the right to violate federal civil rights law any more than private businesses have the right to discriminate against customers. The evidence shows that these security procedures were specifically designed to circumvent fair housing protections and maintain racial segregation. He paused and pulled out a document that had become central to the federal investigation. This training manual from Heritage Protection Services explicitly instructs security personnel to use different standards for what they call traditional versus non-traditional residents. The coded language is designed to encourage racial profiling while providing plausible deniability. Senator Hayes examined the document with growing discomfort as he realized that Allen had just demolished his property rights argument with concrete evidence of systematic discrimination. The hearing's most powerful moment came when Allen was asked to explain the personal impact of his experience. His voice took on a different quality as he moved from policy analysis to human testimony. Committee members, I want you to understand what it feels like to be successful, accomplished, and wealthy, but still be treated as a threat because of your skin color, Allen said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of similar experiences. I built a company from nothing, employ hundreds of people, and contribute millions in taxes. But none of that mattered when security guards decided that my melanin made me dangerous. The silence in the hearing room was profound as representatives and senators processed the implications of Allen's words. Here was someone who had achieved the American dream in every measurable way, yet still faced the kind of discrimination that most white Americans assumed had ended decades ago. The most insidious aspect of this discrimination, Allen continued, is that it operates through 1,000 small humiliations designed to make you question whether you really belong. It's psychological warfare disguised as security procedures, and it's devastatingly effective at maintaining segregation without explicitly violating civil rights law. Representative Lewis called for a brief recess, and Allen found himself surrounded by congressional staff, civil rights advocates, and reporters who recognized that his testimony had just provided the foundation for the most significant civil rights legislation in decades. The most unexpected approach came from Senator Hayes, who had challenged Allen's recommendations but now seemed genuinely affected by his testimony. "Mr. Garrity," the Florida senator said quietly, "I want to apologize for my earlier skepticism. Your evidence is overwhelming, and your personal experience puts a human face on what I had been treating as a policy abstraction." Allen shook the senator's hand with genuine respect for someone willing to change his position based on evidence. "Senator Hayes, I appreciate your willingness to listen. This isn't about partisan politics. It's about ensuring that civil rights protections actually protect civil rights." When the hearing resumed, Chairman Lewis announced that the committee would be fast-tracking the Civil Rights in Private Communities Act, legislation that incorporated all of Allen's recommendations and established federal oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar discrimination networks from operating. "Mr. Garrity," Chairman Lewis said, "your courage in documenting and reporting these violations has given Congress the evidence we needed to address a problem that has been hiding in plain sight for too long. The legislation we're proposing today will ensure that no American faces the kind of systematic discrimination you experienced." As Allen prepared to leave the hearing room, he was approached by a small, elderly woman who introduced herself as Dorothy Height Jr., the granddaughter of the legendary civil rights leader. Her presence at the hearing added historical weight to proceedings that were already being compared to landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s. "Mr. Garrity," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose family had fought these battles for generations, "what you've accomplished here reminds me of what my grandmother used to say. Sometimes the most important victories come from people who simply refuse to accept being treated as less than fully human." The comments stayed with Allen as he left Capitol Hill and prepared for the media interviews that would cement his role as a civil rights advocate. In 3 weeks, he had gone from a successful businessman who just wanted to get into his own house to someone whose testimony was reshaping federal law. But the most satisfying development had come that morning, before his congressional testimony. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had voted unanimously to dissolve their existing security contract and implement new procedures based on federal civil rights guidelines. Patricia Whitman had been forced to resign as board president, and the community was now being held up as a model for how private associations could reform discriminatory practices. More importantly, Maria Gonzalez had been hired as the community's new director of resident services, a position that gave her oversight of all security procedures and the authority to ensure that no one else would experience the harassment she had endured. Her transformation from victim to authority figure had been one of the most personally satisfying outcomes of the entire investigation. That evening, as Allen prepared for interviews with 60 Minutes, CNN, and the New York Times, he reflected on how his morning confrontation with Webb's security team had become a catalyst for the most comprehensive civil rights investigation in decades. The systematic discrimination he had documented was being dismantled piece by piece, and the legal precedents being established would protect future victims for generations. His phone buzzed with a text message from Theola Machuca, who had been hired by the FBI as a consultant for investigating discriminatory security practices in other communities. Her message was simple but profound. "Thank you for having the courage to fight back. Thousands of people will benefit from what you started." As Allen prepared to continue his media interviews, he realized that his morning's decision to document Webb's harassment had accomplished something far beyond his original intentions. He hadn't just exposed one community's discriminatory practices. He had illuminated a network of systematic oppression that reached into every corner of American society. The gates of Willowbrook Estates had become a symbol of something much larger than one man's fight for dignity. They had become the focal point of a national reckoning with the reality that civil rights promises meant nothing without the courage to enforce them. And Allen Garrity, who had simply wanted to be treated with basic human dignity, had become the catalyst for ensuring that promise would finally be kept. The revolution had reached the highest levels of government, and there was no going back now. 6 months after the morning that shattered Willowbrook's gates of discrimination, Allen stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, watching President Biden sign the Civil Rights in Private Communities Act into law. The ceremony was both a celebration and a sobering reminder of how far the country still needed to travel on its journey toward genuine equality. The investigation that began with Webb's power trip had metastasized into something unprecedented in modern civil rights enforcement. Federal prosecutors had secured convictions against 127 individuals across 17 states, with prison sentences ranging from 18 months for low-level security guards to 15 years for the architects of Operation Gatekeep. Heritage Protection Services and its network of affiliated companies had been dismantled entirely, their assets liquidated to provide compensation for the estimated 12,000 victims who had suffered harassment under their discriminatory protocols. Allen adjusted his Navy Tom Ford suit, a deliberate echo of the burgundy one he'd worn during his confrontation with Webb, and surveyed the assembled crowd of civil rights leaders, congressional representatives, and media personnel who had gathered to witness history being made. The legislation bearing his testimony as its foundation would fundamentally reshape how private security operated in residential communities, establishing federal oversight mechanisms that made discrimination not just illegal, but economically catastrophic for anyone foolish enough to attempt it. "Ladies and gentlemen," President Biden began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who had witnessed decades of civil rights struggles. "Today we sign legislation that ensures every American can access their own home without fear of harassment, intimidation, or discrimination. The courage of individuals like Allen Garrity has reminded us that the promise of equal protection under law requires constant vigilance and the willingness to stand up to systematic oppression wherever it exists." The president's words resonated across the Rose Garden as Allen reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. What had started as a personal confrontation with racist security guards had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how discrimination operated in America's most exclusive enclaves, and the solutions they had developed would protect future generations from similar harassment. The most satisfying aspect of the legislation was its enforcement mechanisms, which had been designed with input from Allen and other victims to ensure that civil rights violations would carry consequences severe enough to actually change behavior. Private security companies would now face federal licensing requirements, mandatory civil rights training, and financial penalties that could reach into the tens of millions for systematic discrimination. More importantly, communities with histories of discriminatory practices would be subject to federal monitoring that made future violations virtually impossible to hide. After the signing ceremony, Allen was approached by Dr. Amara Johnson, the Emory University sociologist whose research had provided crucial context for understanding the broader implications of exclusionary gatekeeping. Her latest study, published in the American Journal of Sociology, had used the Willowbrook case as a framework for analyzing similar practices in over 500 communities nationwide. "Mr. Garrity," Dr. Johnson said, her voice carrying the excitement of an academic whose theoretical research had resulted in concrete policy changes, "the preliminary data from the first 6 months of federal oversight is remarkable. Communities that implemented the new civil rights protocols have seen an 89% reduction in harassment complaints, and more importantly, a significant increase in diversity among residents and service workers." Allen listened with genuine satisfaction as Dr. Johnson outlined the measurable impact of the legislation that bore his testimony as its foundation. The systematic changes they had fought for weren't just symbolic. They were producing real results that improved people's lives in tangible ways. The most personally meaningful development had occurred 3 months earlier, when the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice had established the Allen Garrity Fellowship Program, designed to provide legal support for individuals facing discrimination in private communities. The program funded attorneys, investigators, and advocacy resources for people who lacked the resources to fight back against systematic harassment, ensuring that future victims wouldn't need to be millionaires to demand equal treatment. Allen's phone buzzed with a text message from Maria Gonzalez, who was attending her daughter's graduation from law school that afternoon. Maria's transformation from victim to advocate had been one of the most inspiring outcomes of the entire investigation. Her position as Director of Resident Services at Willowbrook had evolved into a consulting role with the Department of Justice, where she helped communities implement civil rights reforms that actually protected residents rather than simply creating bureaucratic paperwork. "Mr. Allen," her message read, "Carmen graduated summa cum laude and wants to specialize in civil rights law. She says you inspired her to fight for people who can't fight for themselves. Thank you for showing us that courage is contagious." The message brought tears to Alan's eyes as he realized that his morning's confrontation with Webb had created ripple effects that would continue for generations. Carmen Gonzalez's decision to pursue civil rights law meant that the battle for equality would continue with advocates who understood both the personal cost of discrimination and the power of systematic resistance. As the White House reception continued, Alan was approached by Theola Machuca, whose documentation of Webb's discriminatory practices had provided the foundation for the federal investigation. She now served as the FBI's senior advisor on private security civil rights, a position that gave her oversight of compliance monitoring in communities across the country. Alan, she said, using his first name as their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, "I wanted to show you something that I think you'll find meaningful." She handed him a folder containing photographs and testimonials from communities that had implemented the new federal guidelines. The images showed diverse groups of residents, service workers, and security personnel working together in environments that prioritized safety through inclusion rather than exclusion through intimidation. "These are communities that used to operate exactly like Willowbrook," Machuca explained, pointing to before and after demographic data that showed remarkable changes in residential diversity and complaint patterns. "The federal oversight requirements have fundamentally changed how private security operates. What you started has literally transformed hundreds of communities." Alan studied the documentation with growing amazement. The systematic changes they had fought for were producing results that exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Communities that had once maintained segregation through harassment were now actively promoting diversity and inclusion, not because of moral enlightenment, but because the financial consequences of discrimination had become too severe to risk. The afternoon brought a series of meetings with congressional leaders who were already planning the next phase of civil rights reform. The success of the Private Communities Act had created momentum for broader legislation addressing discrimination in corporate security, municipal police departments, and even federal law enforcement agencies. Alan's testimony had become the template for a comprehensive examination of how systematic bias operated across American institutions. The most significant meeting was with Attorney General Merrick Garland, who outlined plans for expanding the federal civil rights investigation beyond private communities. The evidence collected during Operation Gatekeep had revealed connections to discriminatory practices in corporate environments, municipal police departments, and private security firms serving commercial properties. "Mr. Garrity," Attorney General Garland said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent his career fighting for civil rights, "your courage in documenting and reporting the discrimination at Willowbrook has given us the foundation we need to address systematic bias across multiple sectors of American society. The investigation you triggered has become a model for how federal agencies can work together to dismantle networks of discrimination." Alan listened with growing understanding as the Attorney General outlined the scope of what his morning confrontation had ultimately accomplished. The federal investigation had exposed not just discriminatory security practices, but an entire ecosystem of businesses and organizations that had been maintaining racial segregation through systematic harassment and intimidation. The most unexpected development came when Alan was invited to address a joint session of the European Parliament about American approaches to combating residential discrimination. The Willowbrook case had attracted international attention as an example of how systematic bias could be addressed through comprehensive legal reform, and European policymakers were interested in adapting similar approaches for their own communities. "The international implications of your case are remarkable," explained Dr. Sarah Chen, who had led the FBI's Civil Rights Division investigation and was now being considered for a position with the United Nations Human Rights Council. "Countries across Europe and Asia are dealing with similar patterns of residential discrimination, and the legal framework we developed here is being studied as a potential model for international human rights enforcement." As the day continued with interview after interview, Alan reflected on how his decision to fight back against Webb's harassment had accomplished something far beyond his original intentions. He hadn't just exposed one community's discriminatory practices. He had created a template for identifying and dismantling systematic oppression wherever it existed. The most personally satisfying moment came during his final interview of the day, when a young black reporter asked him what advice he would give to other people facing similar discrimination. "Document everything," Alan replied without hesitation. "Video, photographs, witness statements, incident reports. Create a comprehensive record that makes denial impossible. Then find allies who share your commitment to equality and use every available resource to demand accountability. Most importantly, understand that your individual courage can create systematic change that protects thousands of future victims. The interview ended with a question that crystallized the broader significance of the Willowbrook case. Mr. Garrity, do you believe that real change is possible when it comes to racial discrimination in America? Allen paused for a moment, thinking about Webb and Johnson serving federal prison sentences, about communities across the country implementing civil rights reforms, about Maria Gonzalez's daughter pursuing civil rights law, and about federal legislation that would protect future generations from the harassment he had endured. I believe, he said finally, that change is not just possible. It's inevitable when good people refuse to accept systematic oppression as normal. The question isn't whether progress will continue, but whether each of us will have the courage to contribute to it when our moment comes. As Allen prepared to leave Washington and return to Atlanta, he realized that his morning confrontation with Webb's security team had become part of a much larger story about America's ongoing struggle to fulfill its promise of equality. The systematic discrimination he had documented was being dismantled piece by piece, and the legal precedents being established would protect victims for generations to come. The gates of Willowbrook Estates had become a symbol of something far more significant than one man's fight for dignity. They had become the focal point of a national reckoning with the reality that civil rights required not just laws, but the courage to enforce them when systematic oppression disguised itself as legitimate authority. And Allen Garrity, who had simply wanted to be treated with basic human dignity, had become the catalyst for ensuring that America would finally keep its promise of equal justice under law. The revolution had reached its intended destination, a nation where the content of one's character truly mattered more than the color of one's skin. The journey wasn't complete, but the direction was irreversible, and the destination was no longer in doubt. 1 year later, on a crisp August morning that mirrored the weather from his life-changing confrontation, Allen Garrity stood once again at the gates of Willowbrook Estates. But this time, everything was different. The ornate iron barriers that had once symbolized exclusion now bore a bronze plaque reading Civil Rights Memorial Gate, dedicated to equal treatment under law. The security booth had been transformed into a welcome center staffed by community volunteers who greeted residents and visitors with genuine warmth rather than suspicious scrutiny. Most remarkably, the morning shift was supervised by Theola Machuca, who had returned to Willowbrook not as a security guard, but as the community's director of inclusive safety, a position that made her responsible for ensuring that every person entering the community was treated with dignity and respect. Allen drove through the gates in the same silver Lamborghini he'd been blocked from driving exactly 1 year earlier, but now children waved from the sidewalks, residents called out friendly greetings, and the entire atmosphere radiated the kind of genuine community spirit that money couldn't buy but courage could create. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates had become a case study in how systematic change could reshape not just policies, but the fundamental character of a community. The federal oversight requirements had initially been met with resistance from some residents, but the results had been so positive that the community now served as a model for inclusive security practices nationwide. Residential diversity had increased by 340% over the past year, with the community now home to families from 17 different ethnic backgrounds. Property values had actually increased rather than decreased, contrary to the fears expressed by some board members, apparently because inclusivity attracted successful professionals who valued communities that reflected America's diversity rather than its historical divisions. Allen pulled into his circular driveway, where Maria Gonzalez was waiting with a smile that could have powered the entire community. Her transformation from frightened victim to empowered advocate had been one of the most inspiring outcomes of the entire ordeal, and her presence at his home had special significance on this anniversary morning. "Mr. Allen," Maria said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had discovered her own power to create change. "Are you ready for today's ceremony?" Allen nodded, adjusting the burgundy Tom Ford suit he'd worn deliberately to echo his original confrontation outfit. Today's ceremony would officially establish the Willowbrook Civil Rights Education Center, a facility designed to teach future generations about the importance of standing up to systematic discrimination. The center would be housed in the former Heritage Protection Services training facility, a conversion that struck Allen as poetically appropriate. "Maria, I still can't believe how far we've come," Allen said, genuinely amazed by the comprehensive changes that had resulted from his morning's decision to fight back. A year ago, you were hiding behind rose bushes. Today, you're the keynote speaker at a civil rights education ceremony. Maria's laugh was rich with the satisfaction of someone who had not only survived trauma but transformed it into purpose. Mr. Allen, you taught me that courage is contagious. When you refused to accept being treated as less than fully human, you showed all of us that we had the power to demand better. They were joined by an unexpected guest, Marcus Webb, the former security supervisor whose harassment had triggered the entire chain of events. Webb's appearance might have been shocking a year earlier, but his presence today served a different purpose entirely. Webb had served 8 months of an 18-month federal prison sentence before being released on probation contingent on his participation in a restorative justice program. The man who emerged from federal custody bore little resemblance to the arrogant supervisor who had orchestrated systematic discrimination. Prison had apparently provided Webb with considerable time to reflect on the consequences of his actions, and his transformation had been as comprehensive as the community's. Mr. Garrity, Webb said, his voice carrying genuine humility that would have been impossible to imagine during his days of uniformed authority, I wanted to thank you for agreeing to participate in my restorative justice process. What I did to you and Mrs. Gonzalez was inexcusable, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to make amends. Allen studied Webb's face with the attention of someone who had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and calculated performance. What he saw was a broken man who had been forced to confront the ugliness of his own prejudices and was genuinely attempting to rebuild himself into someone better. Marcus, Allen said, using the man's first name for the first time, I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge the harm you caused. The question now is what you're going to do with the rest of your life to make sure other people don't experience what you put us through. Webb nodded earnestly. Mr. Garrity, I've been working with the Department of Justice to develop training programs for security personnel. My experience, both causing harm and facing consequences, gives me unique insight into how discrimination operates and how it can be prevented. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a caravan of vehicles that transformed the morning into something resembling a state visit. Federal officials, civil rights leaders, congressional representatives, and media personnel descended on Willowbrook with the efficiency of a well-coordinated operation designed to commemorate historical significance. The most important arrival was Dr. Martin Luther King III, whose presence added generational weight to ceremonies that were already being compared to landmark civil rights commemorations of previous decades. His decision to participate in the Willowbrook ceremony represented an endorsement of Allen's approach to combating systematic discrimination. Mr. Garrity, Dr. King said, his voice carrying the authority of someone whose family had shaped the modern civil rights movement. What you accomplished here reminds me of something my father used to say. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Allen felt the weight of that legacy as he prepared to address the assembled crowd of several hundred people who had gathered to commemorate the anniversary of his confrontation with Webb's security team. Representatives from communities across the country were present to learn about Willowbrook's transformation, and international observers were documenting the ceremony as an example of how systematic discrimination could be addressed through comprehensive reform. Friends, Allen began, his voice carrying across the crowd with the confidence of someone who had learned to speak truth to power. 1 year ago, I was denied entry to my own home because security guards decided that my skin color made me a threat to community safety. Today, we gather to celebrate not just the transformation of one community, but the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they refuse to accept systematic oppression as normal. He paused as applause rippled through the crowd, then continued with the kind of moral clarity that had made his congressional testimony so compelling. The lesson of Willowbrook is not that discrimination has been eliminated. It's that discrimination can be defeated when good people work together with courage, persistence, and an unshakable commitment to equality. The ceremony's most powerful moment came when Maria Gonzalez stepped to the podium to deliver remarks that crystallized the human impact of systematic change. Her transformation from victim to advocate had become central to the Willowbrook story, and her words carried the authority of someone who had experienced both the pain of discrimination and the power of resistance. 1 year ago, Maria said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment, I was a 62-year-old housekeeper who hid behind rose bushes because security guards made me feel like a criminal for trying to do my job. Today, I am the Director of Victim Services for the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, helping other people find the courage to fight back against systematic harassment. She paused as the crowd erupted in applause that reflected genuine admiration for her remarkable journey. The lesson I learned from Mr. Garrity is that courage is not the absence of fear. It's the decision to do what's right despite being afraid. When he stood up to those security guards, he didn't just protect himself. He protected every person who would come after him. The afternoon brought the ceremony's climactic moment, the dedication of the Civil Rights Memorial Gate, which would serve as a permanent reminder that the promise of equality required constant vigilance and the courage to enforce it when systematic oppression disguised itself as legitimate authority. As Alan cut the ceremonial ribbon that officially opened the memorial, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. His morning confrontation with Webb's security team had accomplished something far beyond his original intentions. He hadn't just exposed one community's discriminatory practices. He had created a template for identifying and dismantling systematic oppression wherever it existed. The statistics from the first year of federal oversight were remarkable. Over 800 communities had implemented comprehensive civil rights reforms. Harassment complaints had decreased by 78% nationwide. More importantly, residential diversity in previously exclusive communities had increased dramatically, suggesting that the changes were not just procedural but genuinely transformative. The most meaningful development had occurred 6 months earlier, when Carmen Gonzalez, Maria's daughter, had been hired as a staff attorney for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Her decision to specialize in housing discrimination law meant that the battle for equality would continue with advocates who understood both the personal cost of systematic bias and the power of organized resistance. As the ceremony concluded and guests began to depart, Alan found himself standing once again at the gates that had started everything. But now, instead of barriers to his own home, they represented something far more significant. Proof that systematic discrimination could be defeated when ordinary people found the courage to demand extraordinary change. Theola Machuca approached him as the sun began to set, painting Willowbrook's perfectly manicured grounds in golden hues that made everything look like a Norman Rockwell painting designed by someone who actually understood America's diversity. "Alan," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice triumph over seemingly impossible odds, "I wanted you to know that applications for the Alan Garrity Fellowship Program have increased by 340% this year. People across the country are finding the courage to fight back against discrimination because of what you started here." Alan smiled as he realized that his morning's decision to document Webb's harassment had created ripple effects that would continue for generations. The systematic changes they had fought for were producing results that exceeded his most optimistic expectations, and the legal precedents they had established would protect future victims who might never know his name but would benefit from his courage. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unexpected source. Johnson, the security guard whose arrest had been the first domino to fall in the federal investigation. Like Webb, Johnson had participated in restorative justice programming and was now working with community organizations to train security personnel in civil rights compliance. "Mr. Garrity," the message read, "thank you for showing me that there was a better way to serve communities than through fear and intimidation. The work I'm doing now gives my life meaning that I never found in harassment and discrimination." As Alan drove home through streets that had been transformed from symbols of exclusion into models of inclusion, he reflected on the most important lesson of the past year. Systematic change was possible when individual courage combined with collective action to demand accountability from people and institutions that had operated without consequences for too long. The gates of Willowbrook Estates no longer represented barriers to equality. They had become symbols of what America could accomplish when it finally decided to keep its promise that all people were created equal and deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Alan Garrity had simply wanted to get into his own house that August morning. Instead, he had opened doors for thousands of people who would never have to experience the systematic discrimination that had once masqueraded as community security. The revolution was complete, but the work of maintaining its victories would continue for generations. And thanks to the courage of one man who refused to accept being treated as less than fully human, that work would be carried forward by advocates who understood that equality was not a destination but a daily choice to treat every person with the dignity they deserved. The gates were open, and they would never close on equality again. As Alan pulled into his driveway for the final time in this story, he realized that sometimes the most important victories began with someone simply refusing to accept systematic oppression as normal. His morning's confrontation with Webb's security team had become part of a much larger story about America's ongoing struggle to fulfill its promise of equality. The systematic discrimination he had documented was being dismantled piece by piece. The legal precedents he had established would protect victims for generations to come, and the community he had fought to join had become a symbol of what inclusive excellence could accomplish. Alan Garrity had won more than entry to his own home. He had won a victory for every person who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. And in a nation still struggling to perfect its promise of equality, that victory would echo through history long after the gates of Willowbrook Estates had crumbled to dust. The morning that had started with discrimination had ended with transformation. The man who had simply demanded dignity had delivered justice. And the community that had once symbolized exclusion had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that America could still become the nation it had always promised to be. Sometimes, Alan reflected as he walked into his home for the last time in our story, the most important revolutions began with someone simply insisting on being treated like a human being. Everything else was just details.